I'm going to be talking about the Jewish ghetto in the 19th and 20th century before Terezin. In the 18th century, many Jews moved from Prague to the countryside because of family laws. Some Jews that were not able to move because of laws restricting them from leaving Prague forced them to break these family laws and secretly marry or set up in a household situation. In the mid 19th century, these laws disappeared and Jews were able to move about freely. With this came new possibilities and a better economic life for the Jews in Prague. In 1897, when the fall of the Badeni government occurred, Jews found themselves threatened. Their lives, freedoms, and properties were taken from them. Badeni was then elected to the Imperial Council, where he made the use of both Czech and German legal. This was not taken well by the Germans. German students marched throughout Vienna and Prague, chanting patriotic songs and threatening slogans. The anger was mostly taken out on the Jews and their shops, regardless if they avowed to the German nationality or not. On April 1st, 1899, the body of a young murdered Christian girl was found. Suspicion fell on a local Jewish footwear journeyman named Leopold Hilsner. Some felt that this was a ritual act as it occurred near the coming of a Jewish holiday. Anti-Jewish hunts and attacks broke out throughout the entire country. Anti-Semitism became, because of the Hilsner affair, caused not only attacks in the press, but clear discrimination of Jews by boycotting of the Jewish shops and causing issues within their economic situations. In 1880, there were over 20,000 Jews in Prague, and by 1921, 40% of the total number of Jews in Bohemia now resided in Prague. The late 19th century was characterized by the relations between the Czechs and the Germans. Prague was one of the only towns that did not banish the Jewish population at this time. Eventually, the Czech Jewish movement began with the Jews fighting the Czechs and German nationalism, anti-Semitism, and growing tendency of the Zionist movement. This was done mostly by the Society of Academians Jews. Later, the Czech Jewish newspaper contained articles against German Jewish schools. Overall, throughout history, the Jews did as much as they could to melt themselves into the Czech culture, but many did not accept them. At the beginning of the 20th century, 92% of Jews chose to be of the Czech nationality, but majority of them only spoke German, which caused large issues. Some felt that Jews would never be of the Czech or German nationality strictly because they were Jewish. After the 1900s, Zionist ideas spread to other Czech towns, although Zionists only made a small contribution to the Jewish idea in the 20th century. The Jewish town was mostly densely populated in Prague throughout this history. Anti-Semitic circles began to show activity at the approach of the German fascism. March 15, 1939, which is the date of the occupation and break of Czechoslovakia, meant the beginning of the end for the Prague Jews. Liquidation of the Jewish community began with the setup of a special office which merged all religious communities in Bohemia and Moravia to form one single whole with the aid of Prague religious communities, which concentrated on evacuating all Jewish families. Restriction against Jews began to occur, such as liquidation of Jewish shops and legal and medical practices, the expelling of pupils and students from all schools, and the closing of synagogues. From September 1942, Jews were forced to wear a humiliating badge of a yellow star with the inscription of Jew. From here began the fall of the Jews and the beginning of Terezin.
Today I will be talking about Terezin, also known as Theresienstadt. Joseph II built Theresienstadt in 1780 to protect his kingdom from invaders coming from the north. The fortress was to be the first line of defense against any and all invaders. The fortress is named after Joseph II's mother, Maria Theresa. The fortress was never completely utilized, and by the end of the 19th century, it was mostly abandoned. During the beginning of the 20th century, Terezin was only used for prisoners of war and political prisoners before the Nazis invaded Czechoslovakia. The Nazis finally invaded Czechoslovakian region in March 15, 1939. The Nazis wanted to use Theresienstadt as a place that they could place Jews and other prisoners that opposed their ideas. After invading the Czechoslovakian region, the Gestapo, also known as the Nazi secret police, took over control of Theresienstadt in June of 1940. The Gestapo opened a police prison in the small fortress for those that opposed them, like Czech and Slovak patriots, resistant groups, and other organizations that posed threats to them. During this time, most of the prisoners were forced to work slave labor and also worked in offices aiding the First Reich until the closings of the war. When they were liberated at the end of the war, 2,600 prisoners had perished in the small fortress due to executions, disease, and malnutrition. In November 1941 was when those of the Jewish faith were started to be deported to Theresienstadt. Those who lived in Theresienstadt before the Nazis invaded were kicked out of their homes by the end of 1942 to make room for all the Jewish people the Nazis planned to deport to the ghetto. While the building of the ghetto, to meet the Nazis' needs, Jews were used to create equipment and build beds that would be used by the Jews that resided there. The rooms in Theresienstadt were also said to be extremely crowded, especially because the Nazis kept deporting people to the camp through the years while it was fully functioning. Within 4 years, over 150,000 Jewish prisoners were brought into the ghetto to be housed there, until they were deported to other death camps like Birkenau and Dachau, or concentration camps like Auschwitz. By the end of the war, over 30,000 Jews died within the concentration camp. Hitler wanted to show the world that he was treating the Jews fairly and wanted to bring the Red Cross into Theresienstadt. When the Red Cross was there, they were told to take a specific route to follow, which the route that they followed had shops that were filled with goods and people in very nicely dressed clothes, so that the Red Cross would think that they were being humane to the Jews. The Red Cross concluded that, yes, it was during a wartime, so it was very harsh, but since it was during war, it was okay to live the way that they were living. Theresienstadt was made to be the model concentration camp to show the world that those of the Jewish faith were being treated humanely. With massive amounts of overcrowding in places they had to sleep and live, malnutrition, and disease, death was inevitable in a place like Theresienstadt, and that is why so many had fallen victim within the concentration camp. The Nazis tried to keep the way that they were handling the Jewish problem under control, but the world was bound to find out about the atrocities that they had committed far when the war was over.
The last thing we're going to talk about is the modern Jewish quarter in Prague, also known as Josefov. It's located between Old Town Square and the Vltava River in Prague 1. This area goes all the way back to the 13th century when Jewish people were ordered to leave their homes and forced to live in this one area of Prague, soon turned into the Jewish ghettos. Soon other Jews occupied this area too, from Germany, Austria, Spain, and other countries as well. This area went under structural changes during the 19th and 20th centuries. Buildings were knocked down and the streets were remodeled. Most of the important buildings and monuments are still standing and are very important to the Jews in Prague today. They form the best preserved complex of historical Jewish monuments in all of Europe. There are 6 synagogues. Most famous are the Spanish Synagogue, Old New Shul, and the Old Jewish Cemetery and Jewish Ceremonial Hall. These monuments even survived the Nazi occupation in the 20th century. Hitler wanted to preserve the Jewish quarter as a museum of an extinct race. The Nazis gathered Jewish artifacts from other occupied countries, transporting them to Prague. Old New Shul is the main house of prayer for the present-day Jewish community. The Jewish Museum is very important for Jews in Prague and for Jewish tourists visiting Prague today. The Old Jewish Cemetery is also part of the Jewish Museum in Prague. There are about 12,000 tombstones in the cemetery. It's one of the oldest surviving Jewish burial grounds in the world. Many bodies are buried on top of each other due to lack of space. The Pinkas Synagogue is also a very important visitation spot for Jews today in Prague. Part of it focuses on the Jewish children who were killed in Terezin during World War II. It has children's drawings that were made in the ghetto on display, made between 1942 and 1944. These drawings are very emotional and document the daily life of children in the ghetto and their dreams for the future. Another important monument in the part of the Jewish Museum is the Spanish Synagogue. It focuses on the history of the Jews in the Bohemian lands from the reform of Joseph II into the period after World War II. It displays the most important Jewish scientists, writers, artists, and musicians. It has history on the redevelopment of the Prague town and the history of the Jewish Museum in Prague. The final monument I'll be talking about is the Ceremonial Hall. There's an exposition in the Ceremonial Hall dealing with the Prague Burial Society. It displays a 15-part series of paintings from the 1700s that discusses the ceremonies and customs of death and burial in Prague at that time.